erudite muster of academics has convened in Queen's College Chapel for a solemn purpose, the annual admission of new fellows to their number. It's a complicated ritual which, like the coronation, calls for rehearsal. The leading lady has already been taken through her part by the Master of Ceremonies, Dr James Diggle.
Now, he should remember at that point to get up and give you a copy of the statutes. So, let's pretend I'm the president, and I get up and I give you a copy of the statutes, and you hold that in your right hand, and you now recite the oath. Let's take that as recited. And then you kneel. Off you get. No, don't worry. I shall be standing there to prevent you from falling over the hem of your gown. So, a slight bow. Back behind Charles, and I'm back here now. Steve, you come forward again, and we go through the whole thing again.
To make matters even more tricky, the new fellow has to recite her lines in a foreign language.
Well, yes, if you don't have any pause between in and Sarnish, you're promising to help the college in Sarnish conciliis, which means within sane councils.
Oh dear, that's the way I've been practicing.
On the day itself, the fellows process up the aisle in order of seniority, and such is the solemnity of the occasion that even the organ scholar has departed. Among these are the 35 fellows who, with the president, form the governing body of Queen's College. And this is Dr Diggle, the college praelector, who's about to present Jane Bewick to the president and fellows. Jane will then be admitted for 3 years as a research fellow.
Dignissime Domine Praesidens, cum sociique huius collegii, praecento will be Jane Margaret Bewick, mulierem eruditam, ut in sociam huius collegii admittatur.
Dr Diggle commends Jane Bewick to the president and fellows, and she'll now pledge herself to the service of the college.
Del fidem quod statuta, et laudabiles consuetudines huius collegii, quantum ad me pertinent, elisa observabo, et juvabo collegium in sanis conciliis et auxiliis ad quemcunque statum in futurum pervenero, et hoc laborabo pro posse meo quam diu socius fuero.
It remains now for Professor Oxborough, the president of Queen's, to admit Jane Bewick to the fellowship.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, admitto te in sociam huius collegii.
The admission ceremony, it was a bit like graduating again. I mean, there's the usual kind of anxiety about whether or not you're going to fall backwards down the steps, that kind of thing. I liked the end very much, when everybody sort of files past and welcomes you to the college. There's a sense of actually joining a visible community at that point, as you actually saw these faces going past you.
Jane Bewick has arrived here via Aberdeen University and Girton College, Cambridge, to complete her thesis on themes of death and sensuality in the works of Flaubert. She'll be given rooms in college, 7 free meals a week, and about £5,000 a year. If all goes well, she will advance to a lectureship, and one day perhaps to the cloistered calm of a full fellowship, that enviable estate enjoyed, among others, by Dr Diggle.
One might help out.
Dr Diggle's world existed 2,000 years ago, but to him the dead languages of Greece and Rome are still alive. He lives them, studies them, teaches them.
Corruption, immorality, and contempt of discipline. There was one sinister figure above all, that I had to fight and destroy, the one-eyed Arthur Herbert. He stood high in the favour of the King and the Duke of York and all that. But I, Cicero, was not afraid of him. At school, I don't know, but I think when I came to Cambridge... I very early conceived the desire to be a Don, although it may seem.
Dr. Diggle has a nose for textual inaccuracy. When not teaching, he's at work on the definitive edition of Euripides' tragedies.
Quamquam favori et marci cresci et Gai Caesaris tenebat. Well, I was very fortunate after graduating. I never seriously had to look for any other line of employment, and I can't now conceive of any other line that I would have wanted to do.
Well, this is the original medieval library of the college. I mean, I suppose partly because we've always been so poor, we haven't actually changed this library very much since the late 17th century. This is about the only Cambridge library of that period which is still virtually intact. Here you actually have got the...
Jane Bewick, meanwhile, is getting the feel of her new home. Her tour guide is Ian Wright, fellow in English.
Extensions of art. And, you know, these are, as you can see, that's later decorated woodwork which has been added to extend them upwards when they needed more space.
But then this was actually just a desk originally.
Yes, I mean, I'm not quite sure when the horizontal shelves were put in, but if you look inside each of these, you can see that the old shelf is like that. It's a sloping reading desk.
Oh, I see.
And the manuscripts would have been chained with heavy metal chains running up to a rod. You can still see the socket where the rod came out there. And,
Unfortunately, although unique, the old library is something of a morgue, for the books are rarely opened and the library is usually locked.
Anyway, here are some of the things that we keep on display. And this is a manuscript of that period, that is mid-15th century. I mean, probably, in fact, I'm sure it wasn't actually in the college from that date, but we seem to have acquired it in the 16th century. It's got some very pretty illumination. This is, you know, this is quite a late style. It's very elaborate. The earlier manuscripts are rather simpler. Of course, the first initial is the big one, and then you've got small ones. This one's interesting because, according to this scribble here, the book actually belonged to Mary Tudor at one time.
Oh.
And it's, I mean, I haven't been able to prove it, but it looks as if it was her personal copy. It's a soliloquies of St. Augustine. Cambridge is very paradoxical because people like me, who I suppose are regarded as on the left as far as the governing body is concerned, also tend to end up with responsibilities very often for preserving the past of the college. There is a kind of ambivalence there because you find yourself, as it were, on the one hand, as arguing that Cambridge has really got, and I strongly believe this, I mean, to take more notice of what's going on in the world outside Cambridge and to adapt its customs to suit a changing society, and at the same time, one feels very much the need to defend and preserve much of what is best in our history. You know, I mean, I've clearly got a very sort of deep-rooted affection for the place, which goes right back to my undergraduate period here. In a way, at a time like the present, when Cambridge is under all kinds of pressure, it's a very difficult tightrope to walk, because on the one hand, I mean, I would like personally, for example, to get our admissions system reformed really rather radically so that we have a much more open admissions policy. At the same time, I'm involved in struggling to get money to preserve, you know, 15th century manuscripts in the library. And I don't think that's a completely self-contradictory thing to be doing, but there are times when I switch from one role to the other, and I'm a bit aware of the oddity of it, in a way. But, I mean, I think that's only a contradiction if you take rather a simple-minded view of what tradition, you know, history and traditions are in a place like this.
I suppose when I was younger I might have thought that an Oxford or Cambridge education was the only thing that one ought to aspire to. I'm a little less certain now when one sees one's children progressing very happily at school in a diversity of interests, some of them not specially academic interests. One, I think, comes to realise more that there are other things than pursuing academic subjects at Oxbridge level. I lived in college for 6 years, I should think, before getting married. And when one does that, one's whole life tends to be bound up with the college. One is living here 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. One is inevitably bound up with every issue that is going on, and perhaps unhealthily bound up in them at times. I think there's a great merit in distancing oneself.
Dr. Diggle distances himself by living in North Cambridge with Mrs. Diggle and the 3 Diglets, Charles, Julian and Nicholas.
Well, have a good day.
Yes.
Good. Good hand. would you like to hear something I've been doing?
Yeah.
Well, you know that one of my jobs is to be the orator. Do you know what he does? He delivers speeches in Latin in the Senators. Of course, you two came, didn't you, last year, so you know all about it. But another thing that the orator has to do is once a year he has to go to a service in a church. But the people who've been asked to go and have been paid the same amount for the last 400 years.
What kind of money is it?
Ah, well, do you want to know? Because I've got the envelope here that I was given when the service had finished. Those of us who've been asked to go were given an envelope. I haven't opened it. I thought one of you might like to open it. What does it say?
The University of Cambridge, the Orator.
That's right. Who's going to open it?
It's not money that we get now.
Well, it will be a £1 note. I shouldn't think of that.
Open it.
Oh, do you want me to open it? Well, I'll open it and you find out what it is. Oh, is there a letter? No?
What?
Oh, what is it?
What's that you dropped?
What's that? Who knows what that is?
It's a coin.
It's a coin. What
It's
is
a
it?
coin.
What is it?
Another country coin.
Ever seen one of those before, Charles?
Let me see. No.
What is it?
Let me see. The back looks like the back of a 5p.
Yes, but it's smaller than a 5-penny piece, isn't it? I think I know what it is. That's sixpence in old money. That's real money before it was changed to modern money. Have you done any computer programming since you came home?
Well, then it
But
starts
it's
to
only-
work again.
It'll only be about a year, won't it, before it's your turn to start the recorder, Nicky?
He's got to be in class 4.
Class 4.
I
and
think
will that
I'll
be?
have to go class 3 then 4. Or just go 2, 4.
It would not be entirely accurate to say that the books in the old library were of no use. A vast and ancient tome lies on the table at the termly meeting of the Thomas Smith Society by the chair about to be taken by Dr. Diggle.
Well, James, will you tell us what you have for us this evening, please?
In accordance with our usual custom, I have taken 2 books from Sir Thomas Smith's collection in the old library, which I will pass round for inspection. The first is a work by a certain Franciscus Conanus of Paris, and it's on the appropriate subject of civil law, that is Sir Thomas Smith's own subject. It was published in Paris in 1550, and what is particularly interesting about this book is that it is copiously annotated and doodled in by Sir Thomas. A great doodler was Sir Thomas. In fact, it appears that every time he came in the Latin text to the name of a place, he drew that place in the margin. So here we've got a picture of Paris. And even more amusing later on are the pictures of some of the characters who occur in the text. For example, at this point, we find a man. This is in the life of Carolus VIII. A man married Blancham Widowam, the widow Blanche, and there is a picture of this not particularly appealing widow.
As Franciscus Conanus of Paris circulates with a good claret from Bordeaux, the mood changes from ancient to modern. Richard Fentiman, a law fellow, will give a 15-minute lecturette on reverse discrimination.
Thank you, Master. Well, if you're talking about access to education, if you, let's say, allow a large number of blacks or a fair number of blacks into the more important universities, then the effect would be that because of the springboard that is always given by being in a good university, that they would actually achieve higher places in life. We would suddenly find that there were more MPs, more judges and so on who are black, and that that's the end that we would achieve.
So you're in fact suggesting that a prejudice which might be associated with attendance at a prestigious institution is what should be offered to these people, not the educational advantage.
I think that's actually a very loaded way of describing what I was saying.
But is this situation ever going to arise? Because we never give reasons for rejecting people very sensibly. And what we decide amongst ourselves is what we decide amongst ourselves. And since we never give reasons for deciding anything, nobody can ever sue us for anything about anything.
Well, I think if I may say so, that's a very legalistic attitude to take. I think the point is this, that I'm not actually concerned with being sued or not, as we would if we were in the United States. I'm concerned with whether or not our actions are morally blameworthy, and that's something which sticks to us whether or not anybody knows about it.
Speak for yourself.
I feel absolutely convinced that if I'm in the situation of needing a doctor or a lawyer, what I shall want is the best available doctor or lawyer, rather than someone who's been chosen in accordance with some other criteria.
What would happen if the person who was treating you was someone who was let into Bloggs College, Cambridge, partly obviously because of his A-levels, but partly because he was actually going to be very good in the boat? I'd assume your worries are as great in that situation as they would be in the situation...
You bet they are. It's a situation not too far from reality, I can tell you.
The only thing I think we look for is academic resilience. Now that's a quality which I will tolerate, and it's the kind of quality which perhaps Tony wants in his lawyer or his medic. It's not a kind of quality of flute playing or whatever. It's some kind of depth and integrity. That's all. That's the only other quality I'm interested in.
If the soiree held in honour of the great scholar and statesman Sir Thomas Smith is one of the grace notes to life at Queen's, lunch in the new hall in the modern Cripps building is assuredly not. It's a working meal, an exchange and mart of shop talk and gossip.
That was the kind of thing. Who is Tarsha's tutor? Me. Just for this year. He's usually good. Yeah. He's got the best room in college next year. He would have to. Can you imagine a better man for Sod's law? Oh, God. Have you really? Which is the best room? There I'm at G6, opposite Diggle. Is that a single room? Yeah. Can I make his life unpleasant in other ways?
Because the example ones were no good, were they?
The example ones they were okay, but the thing that's really bad is this kind of mystique they're setting up by saying there's not going to be anything left.
I know, I think that's quite wrong.
The other woman at Queen's high table is Dr. Naomi Siegel, a modern linguist. She's Queen's first woman fellow, and she arrived shortly before the admission of girls here.
One of the problems they wanted a tutor to think about was that since the college was now going mixed for the first time, there may be the possibility of mixed sharing and how the tutors should deal with it. And I think my opinion on this was being generally sounded out. And I said, well, I don't know, you probably had gay couples sharing for centuries, so I don't see that it's all that different. I enjoy supervising very much because the direct contact is mutual entertainment to some degree. The system in the supervision is that you don't first teach them and then examine what they produce. You examine what they produce, and that is the method of teaching.
Which is expected to stay, like all other French women, behind net curtains and just sort of... She's got a very masculine mind. She's got a very
What does that
masculine...
mean?
Well, she's... That par rapport art of the 19th century.
Well, no, I don't think you get away with that. I mean, would it be to distinguish a masculine mind from a feminine mind?
But for a woman in the 19th century,
how do you know what that is?
She is being. I mean, Flaubert's contrasts her. No, she doesn't. No, he doesn't. Which could, yes, right.
But I mean, people often bring that up to say part of the identification between Flaubert and Madame Bovary is. I mean, it wouldn't be nice to say that he's feminine, so we have to say that she's masculine. I wrote a book in the first few months of pregnancy, inspired partly by the fact that I wanted to write a feminist book, and I also wanted to get something, I think a lot of pregnant women feel they want to get something substantial finished at that stage, which they know they've got, and I dedicated the book to Rachel or David, because at the time I didn't know which it was. That was an analysis of an 18th century confessional novel, which means it's a first-person narrative by a man talking about how his life has gone wrong and blaming it on a femme fatale.
Jane Bewick and the other new research fellow, Stephen Bottrell, have been invited to take tea with one of Queen's most eminent and venerable scholars. Sir Harold Bailey was appointed to the chair of Sanskrit at Cambridge in 1936.
The person or around room, it starts over in the corner with the oldest texts, the Rig Veda, coming right down historically. Here you have all the Indo-European books here. All the languages are represented somewhere in in the collection. And up there are gifts from Tehran. And this is a collection of periodic articles sent to me by various scholars over 50 years. And those are articles I wrote myself. If you just glance here, you've got to take one of these. Perhaps this is the one with the darkest writing on it. Some of the bits has been so much used. This is just a photograph from the Parsis in Bombay. And that is the writing before the Arabs came to Persia. The text, which is an encyclopedia of all the main Zoroastrian doctrines. So in itself it's extremely interesting. And for the last 150 years people have been saying they'd make an edition. I was going to do so in 1933, stopped, now started again.
Do it now.
I altogether finished. I thought 4 years then, 3 more might be enough. 7 years on it. Yes. It states that there was first of all a man called Gayumart, a kind of primeval man, and then you come to the first humans. It said they place a purified type of seed in the earth, and from that they grow. Then it goes on, Chehil Sal, Ander Zamik Boed, dat verwandekie Chehil Sol, Repas Carpe Evach Stoen, Ponsda Varg Machre Machrane, Het Zamik Aparusten. That is to say, if you put it into the English, this seed was 40 years in the earth. At the completion of 40 years, as a rhubarb plant, in form with one stalk, with 15 leaves, Mahre the man and Mahrane the woman grew up from the earth.
We were just saying, as modern linguists, we feel very humble.
It's a different
We don't need to cope with the same kind of problems.
What is your field in French? What are you doing?
My work is on Flaubert, 19th century, so it doesn't really present any of the
They have
problems.
philological problems.
No. But for yours, your Dante would be old 15th century.
Oh,
Earlier
yes.
than that, 12th, 13th century.
Yes, but luckily the philological problems have been sorted out by earlier generations, I'm glad to say.
Yes.
To a very large extent, anyway.
So what do you actually do in your research?
I'm looking at possible influences on Dante from 12th century theology, specifically St. Bernard, but it's obviously it's interpretative rather than textual or anything like that.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
And what about you?
Oh dear, mine doesn't really sound quite so scholarly. It's looking at themes of death and sensuality in the works of Flaubert.
Sounds
But it's a
more interesting.
I only have one manuscript, which I bought in a second-hand shop in Cambridge. It contains a list of all the priors of Florence.
Really?
And as they change every 2 months, you see, they had quite a lot to write up.
So, how many languages do you speak altogether?
I'm not a speaker of languages. I try to speak English, that's about all. But
The question really is how many he reads.
reading
Perhaps
all
that
right.
would be
But I don't think I'd be very worried if I were dropped in some of the countries of which I've been reading books. It wouldn't take long before I could ask what you wanted.
How many
But,
can you actually read, do you reckon?
It's impossible to count them, I should think. Everything necessary for the work. Some easily and some less, of course. It's annoying to me when they write a lot of important stuff in Japanese. But although I can read with the dictionary, it takes time. Whereas for Russian, you see, or any European language, it's usually only occasional reference to a dictionary. Quite simple, in fact.
Well, the thing about arts research is that there's no teamwork at all. You declare that there has been no collaboration whatsoever involved in your PhD. So it's you and the library and the books and the materials, and you just get down to it. And that's what I do nearly all the time. Basically, all I do is sit there and work away. So that it's rather nice to have the fellowship and the college as a context for that, because it could be extremely lonely. I mean, at times in Cambridge it has been extremely lonely just doing that, without feeling that there was much purpose to it. Certainly, I mean, that's been wonderful, having the research fellowship, that somebody has decided that I was sort of worth giving one to for a start. It's a tremendous sort of boost.
After lunch, in the senior combination room.
It's always recommend that at the end of the lecture series.
Did he?
Very useful little book here.
In a way, it seems silly not to, really. I mean, in fact, when I'm
teaching Alston people, I feel if they really want to know what I think, it's much quicker if they go and read the book than if they ask me.
Though he retired nearly 20 years ago, Sir Harold Bailey is still part of college life. And even when at home working on Zoroaster, there's a powerful reminder of him here. When this portrait was commissioned, it was Sir Harold's wish that he should be painted not in gown and mortarboard, but in his robes of a Caucasian mountaineer as an honorary citizen of Tbilisi.
Yes. Well, let's describe it. Bottle of claret? Right. Are you going to put this positively or negatively? Well, let's put it positively. Well, in that case, I think you should inscribe. So, Dr. Diggle bets Mr. Hebblethwaite.
No, wrapping it individually and
Not if you then put them in
That there will not be a change of government at the next election? One bottle of claret?
Yeah.
all agrees.
Yes, that comes next, doesn't it, in the formula? What, that there will not be a change of government? At the next general election. Yes. I seem to be on a losing streak, but hope springs eternal.
Well, I put my bottle of whiskey to look forward to redeeming from you in 1990. Even if I, in the interval, lose the general election.
Yes, Mr. Hebblethwaite bets Dr. Diggle one bottle of whiskey that the third volume of his edition of Euripides will not have been sent to the publisher. Yes, that was the error by the end of 1990. No, I'm not optimistic about that one.
Well, in the summer term last year, I wanted maternity leave. And then at governing body it was discussed. And there was something slightly comical about that because I was fairly visibly pregnant then. But it was discussed in very abstract terms if a fellow were to ask for maternity leave. One other thing that was slightly comical afterwards was that one of my colleagues said that a bet had been laid between two of the fellows whether I would come back or not. And I was actually very cross about that because it seemed to me that it implied that women are naturally inconsistent and you must expect them, if they're normal women, to say one thing and do another. And in fact, the fellow who'd bet that I wouldn't come back said to me, well, I must just conclude that you're not really a woman. So I said, well, I'll assume that's a compliment.
Well, may we begin, please? Minutes of the previous meeting have been circulated.
One of the things that struck me as terribly male, actually, was in governing body, there's a certain formality of language and a certain formality in the manner of addressing each other, which is very alien to any outsider first coming in, but which I think is actually a male discourse.
Cambridge College is a very curious institution to work in because it's obviously very traditional, but those traditions are a genuine source of strength and satisfaction, as well as being sometimes a frustration. I mean, take, for example, the way the college is governed. I mean, what one has here is a place which is so old-fashioned and conservative that it's actually much more democratic and genuinely involves people in the decisions than is the case in many other universities. Decisions in this place are actually taken by all the fellows of the college, the teaching fellows, sitting around solemnly in their black gowns, discussing everything from their sherry allowance to, to major investment decisions.
In addition to the old library and Sir Harold Bailey, the third glory of Queen's is undoubtedly Professor Sir James Beament.
Well, it's always been a great love of mine right from the start, since I was a student there. And when I came back to Cambridge in 1948, and for nearly 20 years, I had an enormous amount to do with the college because of my love of and participation in college music, college drama. I actually founded the College Dramatic Society on my 21st birthday, that part of it which I remember, for the simple reason that we made a hell of a noise. And it was the dean who we woke up and who told us the following day to come and see him and tell him to what better use we should put all these histrionic and vocal talents, and the only thing we could think of was to form a dramatic society, and that's how the College Dramatic Society got started. I think it's a sort of sheet anchor in a changing world, because science moves and the organisation of science moves at a tremendous rate. But there's something which has got a family feel about a college. The great advantage of having
a layman might assume that Sir James runs a fruit stall. Sir James is in fact the Professor of Agriculture at the Department of Applied Biology. He has devised a fruit dip. Dip your perishable into his special brew, and the ripening process is arrested.
Are entirely editable. It's been passed as a food additive all over the world. I've eaten large quantities of it, and I don't think it's done me any harm. Now, the starting point was with the banana, and here, as you can see, we've got some bunches of banana, half of which have been dipped, and the other half haven't, and I don't think I need point out much more about how effective the coating has been.
Sir James became an applied biologist almost by chance. He was one of the bright young men that C.P. Snow drafted into a special group set up to combat insect-borne diseases during the war. As a result, the Naples typhus outbreak of 1944 was checked by a new chemical called DDT.
We had a wonderful time because we were capturing tramps from under Hungerford Railway Bridge in order to get hold of the lice. We were feeding 2,000 to 4,000 lice on ourselves every day. The lice is a peculiar animal in that the species will only feed on its own host. There's a human louse or two of them, and then there are individual lice for every other animal. But we used to keep them in little tiny pill boxes with a perforation and under an elastic harness on our legs, and wear them on one leg one day, the other leg the other, for 16 hours a day. We even actually slept with the pill boxes under our pillow at night. But they would sometimes drop out, and there was one terrible incident that I remember when I'd been to a concert at the Royal Albert Hall. It wasn't until I got on the bus afterwards and felt my leg, and they weren't there any longer. And someone must have picked up these pillboxes and looked inside with all the creepy crawlies. And I think all one needs to say at the end of the day that there was, as there always would be in wartime, a minor scare of germ warfare. It was all tidied up again. London was full of scares at the time. But that was how I really got into entomology and the biological sciences, having started off in a totally different way.
In midsummer, Cambridge doles out bouquets to the great and the good in the form of honorary degrees. It's a time when the University Orator comes into his own.
Well, you know that I've got to deliver some speeches in the Senate House tomorrow for people who are being given honorary degrees because they've done such important things. Well, one of the people I've got to deliver a speech for is a professor of mathematics and geometry called Sir Michael Atiyah. So I thought of a plan which was to write a poem instead of a speech, because I thought that the audience might find this more interesting. And then I thought, to make it even more interesting, I would make it a funny poem. Would you like to hear the funny poem I've written about this famous mathematician called Sir Michael?
Yes.
Euclides protos hiuretes geometriae clivebat, quin venit rhombus et quadras symmetriae computes, figuras aequicrurias, quid prosient divinae trianguli concordiae, ververe tetragonos. Euclides alter nunc ades, qui spatia perscrutatur, nec formam, nec symmetriam, nec finem aventia ullum. Vibratio nem sipotes cordae demetiri, vel nutum cum quasauris poltisco agulatae. Si terna derna triciens quod sinskis computare, ubi mutarunt locum pedescum iumdico cerebro. Si in ludo calculica les nec obvius venire pavescis solitario vel formulae rimani, ad summam, si no mentibist tales aut Archimedes, intellegas quid indicet, fortasse, lex atiae. Do you think anybody will understand it? If they know Latin. If they know Latin. But fortunately they've got the translation. Do you think that they'll realise that it's supposed to be a bit funny? Do you think it's a bit funny?
Yes. Does he
Yes.
like his some my reading?
Well, yes, that would be a change. After I've been doing my reading, you do some for me.
Look at that haystack,
Yes.
said the policeman. Roger looked at the haystack. Johnny looked at the haystack.
June the 14th. On every college, the flags are flying. For For this is a royal occasion. Prince Philip is the Chancellor of the University.
Okay. Okay, yes. Right, gown. Feel rather like a Homeric warrior putting on his armour for a combat. Ah, it's very easy to get these inside out and back to front. Now, if you could just slip that over my head, like that. Thanks. And these bands come in front. Now that should be it, does it look all right?
Yes.
Dr. Diggle's scholarship has been taxed to the full, for he has composed Latin eulogies in honour of 2 judges, an archbishop, 2 professors, a singer, a blind Argentinian author, and a television personality.
I enjoy the job very much. I've always enjoyed writing Latin prose. It's an activity that is much less common nowadays than it used to be. In my day as an undergraduate, everybody was expected to write Latin prose. Nowadays, it's an optional thing that one can do in the tripos. But there's a profound satisfaction to be gained from writing a piece of Latin which you hope will pass as a tolerable imitation of the Latin of Cicero or Tacitus.
The sort of problem Dr. Diggle faces is that Cicero had no word for television personality. No matter. He whose habitat is a glass-fronted box will do, and the orator proves that his dead language still lives. But now the bulldogs are on parade, and the procession to the Senate House begins. Behind the mace-bearers, the Chancellor himself, Prince Philip, with his page in attendance, an undergraduate who always comes from the Vice-Chancellor's College, in this case Downing College. Then the recipients of honorary degrees, the Archbishop of York, the Lord Chief Justice of England, 2 Oxford academics, Dame Janet Baker, and David Attenborough. Next in the procession, the Vice-Chancellor flanked by the Registry and Dr. Diggle. Jorge Luis Borges, the blind Argentinian writer, was not in the procession. But he was in the Senate House to hear the orator hymn his praises in a style reminiscent of his own work, along with the other wondrous words that Dr. Diggle wielded that day.
Euclides protos clurates geometriae quiveva, invelit rhombus et quadrassumetriae computes, figuras aequiflorias, quid prosciendi minae trianguli concordiae, where tetragono. Euclides alternum canes, qui statia perscrutatur, nec formam, nec symmetriam, nec in haberia ullum. Vibratio densipotes cordae demetiri, vel nutum cum passauris poltis coagulatae. Si terna derna qui